have some of those. Located in the white box at the back of the top deck, and on the main deck starboard side underneath the pilot house, we have more. That's called a jet. We've got 6 of them flying around here. Yeah. All right, so what else then? Oh, let's keep talking about heads. That's fun, isn't it? No. How about these things right here on your shoulders? Take a look ahead of you. You see a bridge. Look behind you. You see a bridge. Bridges all up and down the Chicago River. This boat's unique. It's the highest of all the tour boats. So we get the best view. And the closest view is some of those bridges. As a matter of fact, there'll be 5 bridges. We don't have an answer.
You're supposed to sing Rock You Like a Hurricane when the jets go by, remember? I'm sure you will. All right, how you guys doing? Are you guys ready for a boat ride or what? That was all right, but I think we could do a little bit better than that. Are you guys ready for a boat ride or what? Moderately better. Welcome aboard the Summer of George. My name is Adam Seltzer. I run the Mysterious Chicago podcast and blog. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out, and I'm on the History Channel and the Travel Channel all the time. So I am incredibly famous. You should definitely pay attention to whatever I say. But one thing you really should pay attention to, though, is he is not kidding about the low bridges. I haven't been on the river yet today, so I don't really know what the water level is. That's all controlled from out in the locks, but it was raining awfully hard this morning, so there's every reason to think it might be kind of a high water day. Those bridges are, in fact, very low. If you see me saying the duck, please duck. There was a guy just last week, he was standing up here eating a sandwich, didn't listen when I said duck, I didn't tackle him in hand, crash, knock, sandwich was still in his hand, but no head left to put it in. It really makes you think. Alright, so I like to get started with just some very basic architecture 101 stuff. Like, one of the easiest styles of architecture to recognize is called modernism. If you look directly in front of us, you can see any number of buildings that look like plain black rectangles. That's modernism. It's the style that was common in the middle of the 20th century, like the 1950s era, when the idea was just less is more, less is more. But eventually architects did get bored with that and started saying, you know what? Less is a bore. Why don't we take these plain black rectangles and bend them around a little bit? Try a different color or something. Try to bring back some of the cool old styles now that we have better technology to do it with. So then we ended up with a style called postmodernism. And that's a very broad term. Anytime you see a building and don't know quite how to describe it, you can probably just say, oh, how's postmodern? And you'll almost always be right. Just some examples in front of us. You can see the one with the green roof and the steeply pitched dormer, 190 South LaSalle, that's postmodernism. But so is the one directly in front of us with all of these balconies all over it. That one is called 225 Van Buren by Ralph Johnson. Kids like to call that the Minecraft building. We adults call it the Morse code building. You can actually translate the balcony into Morse code, too. The dots and dashes spell out MTRDST over and over again, which means nothing. That's just what you get when you translate those particular dots and dashes. Now, to the right there, rising up into the sky with a pyramid on top and the statue above that, you've probably seen that already, that is called the Board of Trade by Hullabird and Root from 1930. That's going back to before modernism, to the style that came before that, which was Art Deco, the architecture of the Jazz Age, the era of very clean lines, streamlined verticality, and simple geometric art. That particular one by Hullabird and Root, one of my absolute favorites. To the left of that, you can see that smaller cream-colored one with the row of columns towards the top. That's the neoclassical or Beaux-Arts, French for fine arts style, common in the late 19th and early 20th century. That particular one is the Insurance Exchange Building by Daniel Burnham and Company, one of his last buildings. He was one of our most important architects. We'll cover him a few more times. And to the right of that, coming into view now, you can see this thing that's in glass, but the same shape as the Board of Trade, and with what appears to be a lollipop on top. That is the Helmut Jahn's 1990s edition of the Board of Trade. That's something postmodernists really like to do, was take an old style and update it for the 80s or the 90s. Like directly in front of us, you can see this one with a circular thing on top called 311 South Wacker by Cohn, Peterson, and Fox. That was their idea of doing a new for the 90s version of old Gothic cathedral-style skyscrapers from the 1920s. Specifically, that was supposed to be an update of the Chicago Tribune Tower, which if you don't know what that looks like, don't worry, we're going to be passing it later on this tour. And you know, we've lost a lot of height records in Chicago over the years. That's the kind of thing you can't really get that upset about, because it's just the way the world spins. You know that if you build a tall building, somebody else will build a taller one. It's all part of answering the great and ultimately human question of how tall of a building can we really build anyway. But when 311 South Wacker was built, it held the record for being the tallest building in the world that didn't have a name, just its address. And it held on to that record until just a few years ago when New York had to build a much taller building at 432 Park. That gets my goat. I want that one back. But of course, directly behind that, rising above all of the other buildings, as sure as Kilimanjaro rises like Olympus above the Serengeti, the Sears Tower stands 1,451 feet tall. The official name is now the Willis Tower, but locals still refer to it as the Sears under penalty of torture. On a clear day from the observation deck, you can see 4 states. I believe the day selections are Wisconsin, Indiana, Nebraska, and New Jersey. It's always fun to see if anybody believes me about New Jersey. It's Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, and the 4th one is Illinois. So here it is in all of its glory. What you see with the Sears is really 9 of those plain black rectangles, but all bundled together. Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, the architects, loved plain black rectangles. Fazlur Khan, the engineer, the Einstein of structural engineering, described his idea for this as being like cigarettes coming out of a package at different heights. When I do this for school groups, I'm supposed to say straws coming out of a package at different heights, but that is not historically accurate. Now, one individual tower like that wouldn't hold up to the wind very well, but by having 9 of them bundled together like that, they strengthen each other, they make each other stronger, and that whole style, bundled tube construction, actually made skyscrapers cost-effective again. After that first burst in the 20s and 30s when they were building 1,000-foot tall buildings, for a generation or so they decided that wasn't cost-effective, nobody was really building that tall anymore. Fazlur Khan helped bring it all back. Now, at 1,451 feet tall, the Sears Tower was the tallest in the world for a good 25 years, which is a really long time for any building to hold on to that record. It still had the record for highest occupied floor in the United States up until about a week ago when Central Park Tower in New York finally caught up to it. Now, that 1,451 feet, should I sing along with this? Well, that 1,451 feet does not include the antennas, because it's a weird little quirk in architecture rules that spires count but not antennas. If we did include the antennas, that would make it over 1,700 feet, but it's one of those weird little things in architecture. Now, incidentally, the tallest building in the world now is the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, which is 2,700 feet tall. It's about to lose its record at the Jeddah Tower in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. That'll be 3,200 feet tall. However, the Jeddah Tower, the Burj Khalifa, and Central Park Tower, the one in New York that's taller now, were all designed by Chicago architect Adrian Smith, so we still win. Yeah, his office is just a couple of blocks over down that way. Oh, and Adams Street here, the next one coming up, this one was named after me.
Nice.
There's supposed to be an apostrophe there. I keep telling the alderman, he keeps saying, Adam, stop being such a grammar snob. And I'll say, well, technically that makes me a punctuation snob. He'll say, well, there you go. There's a little thing we have, the alderman and me and the alderman and I. To our left now, some prime examples of modernism by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill from the 60s, Gateway 2 and Gateway 1. Now, this is a style that architects would refer to as Miesian, because they look like something that would have been designed by a guy named Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. He was kind of the father of modernism, a German architect that we imported into Chicago. Most of his buildings do look like plain black rectangles, including his gravestone at Graceland Cemetery is a plain black rectangle. Now, they have aged very well, though. In a good Mies-style building, you can never see the seams, you can never see the screws. They're endlessly elegant. Still about as modern now as they were in the early 60s, which is saying something. A lot of early 60s buildings don't really hold up quite that well. These aren't specifically by him, but Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill were so enamored of his philosophy and followed it so rigidly that Frank Lloyd Wright used to call Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill the 3 blind mice. Now, across from it here, we've got some postmodernism from the 80s. Fujikawa and Johnson Chicago Mercantile Exchange Center. This had a stock trading pit in the middle here. It's very little structural support on the inside. It's actually being held up by the 2 towers on the ends here. And these 2 towers were designed very specifically with executives in mind, because you know every executive wants a corner office. Normally you get 4 corner offices per floor. Here between the 2 towers, I think there are 32 corner offices total per floor. So that way nobody has to feel left out and everybody gets to be a winner. Which sounds like a great setup for a joke about millennials, but it was actually for baby boomers. So, yeah, this is not one of the low bridges, by the way. Incidentally, I'm a couple of years older than the millennials myself, but I did try avocado toast the other day and I liked it. For 12 bucks, I better have liked it. Now on the right, the Civic Opera Building by Graham Anderson, Probst, and White, built for a guy named Samuel Insull, a utilities kingpin in 1929. Both a utilities kingpin and a big opera financier. Now there's a lot of urban legends about why it's shaped like a throne, and the real reason is really kind of mundane. Insull knew that operas normally did not make any money, even if you sold every ticket. So the idea was these two towers on the side were going to be office buildings whose rent money would help keep the opera afloat. Which was a very good idea, except that they opened this place in November of 1929, about 3 weeks after the stock market crash that kicked off the Great Depression. So Insull was living up on the penthouse at the time, but over the course of the next few years, he lost all of his money and all the money of 30,000 investors in his holding company, so he had to flee to Greece. Like you do. That's what I do when I lose 30,000 people's money to it. Now, up until recently, there was another Graham Anderson, Probst, and White building right here that was only about 10 stories high. But that's not using what we call the best and tallest possible use of the space, so last year that was torn down. Getz Partners is working on building the new one here. Now the other one, the old General Growth Properties building, nobody exactly missed that one though, so that's alright. But as we go by it, if you look behind, you can see a bit of this brown building, 123 Whacker by Ralph Johnson, same guy who did the Morse Code building. This was intended to be a postmodern 1980s take on the look of the Civic Opera building, which it was right by. Now, it made a lot of headlines in 1986 because Ralph Johnson had designed it primarily on computers, which in 1986 in architecture was still kind of a surprising thing to people. And even now I still meet old architects who are like, you know, these computers are ruining architecture. You must feel every inch of the building with your bare hands. Now on the right, this is another one not using the best and tallest possible use of the space, but we love this one, the Great Lakes Building by Hullibert and Roche from 1912. In 1912, a riverboat tour would have been almost all buildings like this, a whole lot of red brick hugging up close to the edge of the water. Might have seemed kind of grim and Dickensian after a while, honestly. But just one of them like this looks absolutely fantastic. It has a splash of color right when we kind of need it. All right, now here we do have a low bridge. I'm just going to duck under this one. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I love being a tour guide. I literally risk my neck for this job 7 or 8 times per tour. Yeah, definitely don't reach up and try to touch it. They never clean the other side. Over on the right there is, I believe, a postmodern take on a hammock. Seems like we've changed course from how we usually go today, but all right. This place right in front of us here is known as Wolf Point. Wolf Point is what the early pioneers and settlers called this little branch of the water over here where the two branches of the river come together. Exactly why they called it that is kind of lost to history now. Probably just a reference to the fact that there were so many wolves in the environment back then. But this was downtown Chicago to the early pioneers and settlers. Downtown at the time meant 5 or 6 log cabins. Most famous was a place called the Sauganash Hotel, which was not really a hotel so much as it was a tavern. You could pay to sleep there, but you didn't get a bed. You slept on the floor and you liked it. And for an extra fee, you could rent a blanket, but if you fell asleep under that blanket, they would yank it right off you and rent it to somebody else instead. And probably not just to be a jerk, it's hard to imagine how hard it must have been to get clean laundry on the edge of the frontier. So like little things like that we don't always think about. Like it's only been the last couple of generations that we could turn water into ice anytime we felt like it. Like this pink building coming up on the left here is the old North American cold storage warehouse from 1907. And to keep things cool in 1907, they didn't have any windows. The walls were about 3 feet thick. You can see that in some of the new cutouts. And the walls were stuffed with frozen horsehair, frozen cork, and pipes full of ammonia and brine that were pumped through the place as a coolant. In the late 70s, the architect Harry Weiss decided he wanted to turn it into condos and lofts. To do that, he had to first haul away 500 train car loads of frozen horsehair, then thaw the building out for 6 months, then add all of the windows, and these stars you see all over it are not decorations, they're holding the building together. It would have been a lot easier just to tear it down and put up a new one. Honestly, probably a lot cheaper too. But Harry Weiss was a very preservation-minded architect. They used to say never stand next to Harry Weiss in one place for 5 minutes at a time. Otherwise, he will have you declared a landmark. Then the next thing you know, you'll have to get a public hearing every time you want to change your haircut. Okay, this is a low bridge up ahead as well, but even if this were not a low bridge, I always ask people to kind of bow their heads as we go under this one. Just in remembrance of the brave tour group, just like this one, who was going under this bridge 15 years ago this month when the Dave Matthews Band's tour bus decided to let 800 pounds of sewage off the bus and onto the boats. I was not there that dreadful day, but we remember. We remember. Often we see couples taking their wedding pictures right there on the Dave Matthews Band boot bridge. Oh, you can smell the Blommer's factory today, too. About 2 blocks over that way is the Blommer's chocolate factory. It occasionally makes the entire city smell like brownies. I love this city. Now, you'll notice most of the other tours probably aren't talking here. I think the Kinsey Park townhouses over here are paying off a lot of the other companies to have their tour guides go off mic while they go past. But I'm not seeing a nickel of that, so I'll just go ahead and keep on talking. The place was built in the year 2000. It was already completely sold out by the time they opened, though I think a lot of people didn't stop to think about the fact that every couple of minutes a boat was going to go by talking about how much your house was worth. So that's the first question everybody always asks. Last I checked, the townhouses were selling for about 3.5. And they were facing the water. Whereas in the 70s, when they built the East Bank Club over here, they had it with its back to its water. Now and then we can see little hints about that kind of thing, like built right into our architecture. Little hints about different ways that we've interacted with the river, different ways that we've envisioned how city living ought to be, and different ways that we've solved the problems that do come up when you try to cram this many people into such a small space. I mean, the square mile we just rode, we passed about 23 times as many people as live in the entire island of Greenland. So you get that many people together, where do you put them all? Where do you keep their stuff? Where do you park their cars? We have to be kind of creative to make this all work, but we do manage to pull it off. Usually with style. And low bridges. So as we pass this residential area here, I do like playing a game called What Do They Have? This is played by looking off of the boat and into the windows of these condos to see what they have. You guys see anything good? We do have some crowbars for later. This guy's really good stuff in here. Other day we were playing this game and a naked guy walked up to one of the windows. We saw what he had. We always get really good tips on days when there's hardcore nudity on the tours, though. Don't ask me why. It happens a little more than you might think. So, directly in front of us here you can see this tower. On top of the tower is a statue. The statue is called the Herald of Progress. It's an old Montgomery Ward logo. That's the Montgomery Ward Administration Building. The tower is probably covering up a water tower like this one on the right. A lot of times you see a building with a clock tower in the middle of it from the old days. They're actually, those clock towers are there to cover up water towers. Now you see water towers like this in different cities for different reasons. Like in New York, where I work the other part of the year, you see water towers like this on all kinds of buildings because the way the plumbing was built there, if your building was over 5 stories, you needed your own water tower or you wouldn't get much water pressure. Chicago is a little different. Chicago, they added them here for fire prevention. So I don't know if you guys heard about this, but we had a pretty big fire here in Chicago one time. 1871, the whole city burned down. So, of course, after that, we had a lot of meetings about trying to decide what we could do to stop this from happening again. In the newspaper archives a while ago, I found the transcript of a meeting where they argued about whether wood was more flammable than bricks, which seems kind of silly now. But one thing that they did land on was that every large building had to have its own water tower. A fancier building could afford a clock tower, others just left them out in the open. They're invariably made out of wood, too. I always normally think of water towers as metal, but metal would freeze up in the wintertime. Wood kept it better insulated so it wouldn't freeze up. There are about 100 of them left in Chicago now. How many of them are still functional? Nobody really seems to agree on. You can find any number of different answers to that one out there. They're gradually disappearing, so some of them are starting to get landmark status now. Coming up next street is Chicago Avenue. To the left of that is Halsted Street. I just recently found a thing in the archives saying that there was an article saying that the intersection of Chicago and Halsted was the single filthiest intersection in the world. Woo. Now, how they compare that to other ones, I don't really know. It's not like the Parks Department put out data about this kind of thing. But there were a lot of factories lining this, and also a lot of catalog warehouses, which wouldn't sound like such big polluters, but they packed all of their orders in sawdust. Sometimes that sawdust would flow out to the river and just kind of float there, so the factory runoff would have a harder time sinking. They said in those days if you tried to cross over Halsted Street here, you would, if you were wearing a wedding dress, by the time you got halfway across, it would look like you were going to a funeral. But this is where a lot of the catalog warehouses were. There's one up over here on the right, 600 West Chicago, is currently the Groupon building. If you guys are on this tour, you probably know what Groupon is all about. But this is the old Montgomery Ward catalog warehouse. If you order something out of the Montgomery Ward catalog, this is where your stuff was sent from. And to put all the orders together, you see it's a very long building. So they had the clerks going around on roller skates filling the orders. Sometimes I wonder why Amazon doesn't do that, because you hear all these horror stories about the Amazon warehouses, but I think every time I suggest they wear roller skates out loud, if you listen carefully off in the distance, you can hear the sound of personal injury lawyers starting to drool. Now, so this landmass right in front of us is an island, mostly man-made, but not entirely. Back in the 1850s, it was called the Kilgum. In those days, the Chicago Tribune described it as our most fragrant locality. Now, exactly where the name Kilgubbin came from, nobody seems to know. The theory was that it was named after a region in Ireland where a lot of the early settlers came from, but nobody could ever find Kilgubbin on a map of Ireland. And it wasn't for lack of looking. A lot of times on a slow news day, they would send a reporter out to try to find where the original Kilgubbin was. Many tried, none succeeded. But over the years, they came to call it Goose Island instead, just because there were so many geese out there. Even now, we come out here, there are geese in the water all the time. Goose Island is probably best known nowadays as being the home of the Goose Island Brewery. So, a couple of years ago, Goose Island put out a beer called the Illinois. The label was just a drawing of a skyscraper, and it was a skyscraper that was designed but never existed. If it had been built, it probably would have been right around here someplace, far enough back from the water. It was a design by Frank Lloyd Wright for a building that he came up with in the 1950s. It was called Illinois or Sky City at different times. The idea was this building was going to be 5,200 feet tall. More than 3 times the size of the Sears Tower, 4,000 feet taller than the tallest building in the world at the time was. And he was fairly serious about building it too. A lot of times architects design things like this. There's any number of designs on file for mile-high buildings. Now and then somebody will design a 1,000-foot tall statue that people could actually live and work inside of. Or a couple of years back, there was even a thing going around for, it was a design for a skyscraper that wouldn't be on the ground at all. It would be descended from an asteroid that orbited the Earth. And twice a day, residents could parachute into Midtown Manhattan. How they would get back home, and why they would put a parachute into Midtown, not in the financial district or Harlem or something, they never really explained. But usually, when they design things like this, it's not really just because of, it's not really something they actually plan to build. It's more of an intellectual exercise, or at worst, a publicity stunt. Like, nobody really thought they were going to build the skyscraper, the asteroid building, but it got a lot of publicity for the firm. But Frank Lloyd Wright was pretty serious about making Sky City. He had all the designs made up, he met with investors, he met with the city, never quite raised anywhere near enough money to actually build it though. Architects who go over his plans now, some people look over it and say, yeah, this building actually would have worked. He would have needed a lot more bathrooms, but it was structurally sound. And others take a look at it and say, yeah, everybody in this place would have been dead in 3 months. We'll never really know for sure. But he was pretty serious about doing it. You got to give him credit for trying. Green space here is called Montgomery Ward Park. One of the reasons we wanted to commemorate Montgomery Ward is he pushed really hard to push through Daniel Burnham's plan of keeping the waterfront open. Daniel Burnham was one of our great architects, later became a city planner. His plan for Chicago wasn't something that we really followed to the letter, but we did follow a lot of it. One of his biggest plans was that we ought to keep the lakefront as open as humanly possible. Now, he had a very famous quote that's on the wall of every tourist attraction in Chicago. It's at the Sears Tower twice. It would make no little plans. They have no magic in them to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans. Aim high and hope and in work. For years, we had an asterisk behind it because we weren't really sure he'd ever actually said it. In fact, his son wrote a whole letter in the 30s saying he probably never really did. But just recently, Graceland Cemetery had me working on their new Who's Who book. He happens to be buried out there. And while digging through the archives on Burnham, I found a transcript of a speech he made in 1910, and there was the quote, word for word. So I love it when I actually get to solve a mystery in the archives. In fact, one of my favorite mysteries that I ever worked on in Chicago was right up here on Ohio Street. A little further down Ohio, there was a place in the 20s called the Wind Blew Inn with 2 N's. It was run by a teenage flapper named Lillian Colley, a young woman of the jazz age. Cops used to raid it all the time, partly because of rumors that she was selling liquor under the table, which she almost certainly was, but mostly because of rumors that she was hosting petting parties there, make-out parties. So at one point she had to go in front of a judge and say, Your Honor, I solemnly swear, there is no snuggle pupping at the Wind Blew Inn. The judge found her guilty, but sentenced her to read a book of fairy tales to cure her of her bohemian ideals. Worked about as well as you'd think. But she disappeared from the record a few years later. It took forever to figure out what had ever happened to her. I finally found out that she changed her name in the 30s and became a mystery novelist for a while. Lived to a ripe old age, too, which was nice to find out because the vast majority of people I researched end up getting serial killed at the end. Nice to have a happy one now and then. A lot of people ask me about the bridge in front of us that is standing upright. That is the old Kinsey Street Railroad Bridge. When they built it about 100 years ago, it was the largest steel drawbridge in the world. Now, at the time, it went up and down about 30 times a day. Most of these bridges still go up and down. Most of them open up in the middle. They're what's called bascule bridges. They don't open up nearly as often now. It messes up traffic pretty badly when they do. But that one went up and down 30 times a day at first. By the 1990s, only one train was still using it. Just one train picking up the Chicago Sun-Times. And when the Chicago Sun-Times moved their warehouse, no train was still using it anymore. So now they just leave it up permanently. It's got landmark status for one thing. And also, it's so well built, I think it would cost too much money to take the thing down. So it'll just stay up there for the foreseeable future. All right, once again, the Kinsey Street Bridge is going to be one that we want to duck underneath. Now, I talked a little while ago about Harry Weiss, the guy who did the cold storage building conversion. He wasn't just a preservation architect either. He was also a very innovative and rather eccentric architect in his own right. He designed these 4 cool townhouses on the right here, the River Cottages, which opened in 1990. They were designed to look like the sailboats and schooners used to sail up to Old Point back in the old days. Now, 3 out of the 4 are still owned by the original owners. One of them sold a couple of years ago, and I love that that happened because there was a real estate listing, which meant we finally got a lot of pictures of the inside.